Study Session 13. Housing Policy and Administration in Nigeria. Introduction. In this lecture, we shall discuss issues related to housing policy and administration in Nigeria. To this extent, we shall begin by examining the concept of housing as well as the history of housing in the world and Nigeria in particular. From there, we will move on to discuss the role of housing in the Nigerian national development. We shall also discuss the housing policies in other countries, and we shall conclude by examining programs of housing development and administration in Nigeria. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Discuss the history of housing in the world, and Nigeria in particular. 2. Explain the role of housing in national development. 3. Highlight housing policies in other countries. And 4. Discuss the programs of housing development and administration in Nigeria. Pretest. 1. Critically discuss history of housing with special reference to Nigeria. 2. Discuss the role of housing in Nigeria's development. 3. Explain housing policies in other countries with specific examples. 4. Critically assess the programs of housing development and administration in Nigeria. Housing or shelter refers to permanent shelter for human habitation. Because shelter is necessary to everyone, the problem of providing adequate housing has long been a concern, not only of individuals, but of governments as well. First, the history of housing is inseparable from the social, economic, and political development of humankind. From the beginning of civilization, attention has been paid to the form, placement, and provision of human habitation. The earliest building codes specifying structural integrity in housing construction are found in the Code of Hammurabi. City planning activities during the Greek and Roman empires centered almost exclusively on the appropriate placement of urban housing from the perspectives of defense and water supply. These same concerns continued throughout the Middle Ages. In the 13th century Europe, the city became a center of trade, and its walls provided a safe haven from nomadic warriors and looters. People could find shelter for themselves and their flocks, herds, and harvests, while the open country was being overrun by enemies of superior force. Demand for urban housing has increased over the centuries. For centuries, this demand was filled by planned additions to and subdivisions of existing structures. Where climate permitted, squatting, occupying without title of payment of rent, became commonplace, but this provided only temporary shelter. By the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, people were moving to cities in unprecedented numbers. Workers lived in sheds, railroad yards, and factory cellars, typically without sanitation facilities and water supply. In the post-industrial society of the 20th century, housing in developing nations and poor parts of developed countries continues to be of insufficient quality and does not meet the demands of some parts of the population. Vacant, abandoned central city housing exists alongside structures that are usable but overcrowded, and buildings that are structurally reclaimable but are functionally obsolete. Even at present, there is both a demand for housing and a supply of reusable structures that are going unclaimed. This situation is a good example of the complex role housing plays in society. Its primary function was to serve the need for shelter and privacy, but housing must now offer other advantages. First, location, including proximity to the workplace, shopping, businesses, schools, and other homes. Second, environment, that is, the quality of the neighborhood, including public safety and aesthetics. And third, investment potential, or the degree to which home ownership may affect capital accumulation. In Nigeria, the physical stock of housing in the country is one of the nation's principal capital assets. The unique aspects of housing in Nigeria are its density and how it is provided. In Nigeria, the majority of the population live in multi-room homes, most of which have been built by private individuals in small plots of land. Nigeria's housing industry is a largely unorganized group of entrepreneurs who construct housing in their own geographical areas. They decide on the type of housing that will be accepted by consumers and then proceed to provide this housing through the development process. Various laws, institutions, and public agencies work to ensure that private market housing is produced safely by builders and delivered efficiently to consumers. Zoning laws controls the quantity and type of housing, the quality of the housing, and the inclusive services to be offered are determined by building or housing codes. Financing needed to construct and purchase housing is available from lending institutions whose activities are governed by laws. Consumers are afforded access to this housing through a variety of settlement procedures and fair housing laws. Housing has been built in Nigeria in an outward progression from major cities such as Lagos, Ibadan, and Kano, first following railway and then automobile paths such as major roads, beltways, and interstate highways. Housing in these cities was generally either single-family homes, one unit on one lot, typically of brick construction, or multi-family dwellings, multiple apartment units on a single tract of land, also of brick construction. There is no doubt that the different levels of government in the Federation are quite aware that Nigeria is faced with housing problems. As rightly put in the Third National Development Plan document, although Nigeria's housing problem has not been comprehensively studied, theories are enough to give information to conclude that the magnitude of the problem is quite serious. Ministry of National Planning, 1975. Successive development plans have adopted a variety of measures. In the last 50 years or thereabouts, the government authorities in Nigeria have taken a number of measures and adopted a number of strategies like rent control, public ownership, and development of subsidized housing estates for the low-income groups, direct and indirect subsidies to the middle and upper income earners, staff housing loan scheme, establishment of housing scheme, just to mention a few to ameliorate the problems of housing for her citizens. The main questions now are, what are the different housing policy measures introduced in Nigeria? What have been the achievements and limitations of the various strategies proposed and adopted? In the first section of the housing policy document, Housing in Nigeria's National Development, Professor E. O. Adeniyi examined the priorities accorded to housing in national development plans. He established the significant role which investment in housing could play in the economic development of a country. He aptly stated that the exercise of investment in housing should be seen as a stimulating, strengthening, and integrating mechanism that increases employment opportunities, families' income, improves community and urbanization facilities, raises levels of living, and provides more savings for expanding the cycle of investment. Quoted in Omoruyi and Omoibo, 2004, page 214. In spite of the multiplier effects of investment in housing as stated in Economic Development, Adeni illustrated how Nigeria has accorded low priority to programs of housing development, especially during the periods of first and the second development plan. Despite the above, soaring increase in rentage is one of the prime issues of great concern to the governments of this country. The following excerpt from the Third National Development Plan convincingly highlights the problems. As a result of the acute shortage of suitable rental accommodation, especially for the low-income groups in our major towns and cities, rents are extremely high, and the average urban worker often has to pay as much as 40% of his monthly income in rent. This is a major factor in the distortion of income distribution in favor of the property owner and constitutes an obstacle in the realization of one of the long-term goals of our development effort, the attainment of a just and egalitarian society. There is no area of social service where the urban worker in Nigeria now needs relief from desperately than in housing. Ministry of National Planning, 1975. As a result, in 1976, the federal government of Nigeria introduced rent control as a strategy for curbing the soaring rents in the country. Due to the apparent failure of the rent control measures of the federal government, most individuals are advocating a more discreet and selective use of the rent control instrument as a stronger policy emphasis on the incentive in the form of leveraging of more housing supplies, which would lower rents more naturally and help to avoid penalizing those the rent edict intends to help. The role of housing in Nigerian national development. Housing is one of the three basic needs of mankind, and it is the most important for the physical survival of man after the provision of food. It is also one of the best indicators of a person's standard of living and of his place in society. In addition, housing, either in unit or multiple form, is a significant component of the physical form and structure of a community, while the human and family content of the house is part of the very spirit of life and prosperity of the society. In spite of the fact that housing is part of the urbanization process and a measure of a country's level of development and standard of living, housing continues to be regarded as an economically non-productive investment. This is because housing has traditionally been regarded as an unwanted stepchild in the family of projects that constitutes economic development programs, seen as a form of consumption rather than investment, or, in a development jargon, as wholly resource absorbing rather than resource producing. The provision of shelter has been viewed by policymakers as something to be tolerated rather than desired. This attitude by policymakers has resulted in housing being given low priority in Nigerian development planning. The subject of housing has generated much discussion in the country recently and has resulted in a call on the various governments, from the past to the present, of the country to give greater priority to the subject of housing and allocate not less than 10% of their annual budget to housing. Unfortunately, although a considerable amount is known on this subject all over the world, relatively little continues to be done in comparison with overall needs, and housing remains one of the world's most pressing problems, one which is continually growing. A report on housing in Africa produced by the United Nations describes clearly the present state of housing in the continent and shows that the situation is getting worse owing to the increasing impacts of its causes: population growth and, even worse, urbanization. Thompson, 1983. Agbola, 2005. In Nigeria, the planners of the Second National Development Plan recognize that housing deficiency in both quantitative and qualitative terms is a universal problem in the country. Yet, it could be seen from Table 1 that the percentage of planned investment devoted to housing is far from being sufficient to tackle the problem as vigorously as it should be. In the 1962 to 1968 Development Plan, housing was classified as a social overhead, and out of the total sum of $42 million, 62% of total planned expenditure allocated to town planning, including housing, only $19.6 million, or about 47% of the allocation, was actually disbursed. The implementation of the plan in the cities and regions shows clearly that a social overhead was interpreted as not much more than a necessary evil. Third National Development Plan, 1975 to 1980. It is not intended to give a mass of statistics on housing situation in the country, as this is readily recognized in the urban center and is manifested in overcrowding and congestion in buildings, dilapidated houses, and soaring house rents. It is, however, intended to emphasize the importance of housing in national development, to examine current efforts in the provision of housing in Nigeria, and to suggest policies and programs aimed at solving the housing problem. This is done with a view to stimulating interest and provoking discussion on the importance of housing in national development and in finding easy means of solving the growing problems. Housing policy in other countries. Before we discuss the program for housing development, it will be worthwhile to discuss housing policies in other countries. Housing programs in the United States and in Western European nations share many similarities. All these countries have initiated public housing, urban renewal, and new town programs. However, public intervention in Europe began sooner and has been more extensive than in the United States. Britain, for example, embarked on public housing development in the late 19th century. Laborers' Dwelling Act, authorizing local governments to construct public houses, were enacted as early as the mid-19th century, more than 75 years before a comparable U.S. housing legislation was passed. Urban renewal demolition activities were empowered during the same period, almost a century before something similar happened in America. Massive public housing programs were started after each of the world wars. By the 1970s, approximately one-third of Britain's housing was publicly subsidized, compared with only 1 to 2% in the United States. Britain has also constructed several new community developments that are in contrast to the fledgling and largely unsuccessful new town ventures in the United States. Housing policies in other Western European nations are similar to those in Britain. For instance, extensive provision and regulation of housing exists. The form of subsidies for slum demolition and rental housing assistance in Germany, France, the Netherlands, and other Western nations provide low or no interest housing loans. The development of new towns is also encouraged or subsidized. More than 10 housing units have been built on the outskirts of Paris. The problems of housing in Canada, both public and private, have been treated with considerable imagination and effectiveness. Federal funds for housing have been targeted almost entirely at people with lower incomes. The government provides assistance to the provinces and municipalities and to individuals, and this assistance is to be used for neighborhood improvement, the purchase of homes, the rehabilitation of residential housing, and the development of new communities. At the same time, the private sector has channeled a high volume of financial support into the mortgage market. Housing in the former USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and in Eastern European nations was almost exclusively characterized by government regulations and provisions. These countries pioneered the production and installation of massive prefabricated housing units in urban areas. Housing units, usually of precast concrete, were manufactured in factories and then shipped to the housing site, where they were assembled into large multifamily complexes. The former USSR was also a pioneer in developing new towns, which were frequently located around massive industrial or power generating facilities. One example was the town of Bratsk hydroelectric plant in Siberia. Housing in economically developing countries is typically inferior in quality and space to that found in economically developed nations. Government efforts to upgrade housing conditions are evolving slowly. In the 1950s, slum demolition was effected on a large scale in many cities, such as Manila in the Philippines and Baghdad in Iraq. In the 1960s, new town development, such as Brasilia in Brazil, became commonplace. These strategies often proved ineffective. Demolition was not usually accompanied by replacement housing, and the new towns sometimes proved to be an island in a sea of slums. In the 1970s, some developing nations turned to self-help housing. Families were given plots of land and building materials to construct or improve their own shelter. This housing approach is commonly referred to as a sites and services program. So far, such a program has been implemented on a large scale in India and many South American countries. Numerous organizations assist housing development and the upgrading of housing standards. These include the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the United Nations Commission on Human Settlements, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. Program of Housing Development and Administration in Nigeria. In spite of the multiplier effects of investment in housing for economic development, Nigerian governments continue to give low priority to programs of housing development. The program of housing development in Nigeria can, however, be divided into three periods. First, pre-independence. Second, post-independence. And third, post-state creation. During the pre-independence period, the economy was rural and urban dwellers were limited to people involved in the distributive trade or employed in the various government offices and commercial houses. government investment was limited to expatriate civil servant housing and some government departments such as the railways and the post and telecommunications. In June 1958, the then Western Region government established a housing corporation designed to provide high to medium cost houses. The operation of the corporation, however, tended to cater for the higher to the medium income group, with housing estates established at Ibadan and Ikeja. About the same time, the federal government launched housing cost of the lower income workers. The federal government also contributed $1 million to the Nigerian Building Society for the running of a mortgage scheme to enable persons in the high to medium income groups to purchase and own their houses. In addition, the government operated the African Staff Housing Schemes designed to enable the non-expatriate civil servants to borrow money to build and own houses. Towards the time of independence in 1960, Nigeria experienced an upsurge in urbanization, and the need for housing came to a head in the capital cities, particularly in Lagos, where industrial and commercial activities were expanding. The federal government, through the Lagos Executive Development Board, expanded its housing program in Lagos, though the houses provided were scarcely able to meet a tenth of the housing requirements in Lagos. The then Eastern and Northern regional governments also followed the example of the West by setting up housing corporations in 1961, and the Midwestern region also established one in 1963, with housing estates established mainly in the regional headquarters. On the whole, housing administration in Nigeria involves the direct efforts of both the federal and state government, who act through some parastatals, agencies, and departments. Also, some private organizations have played important roles in the administration of housing policies and programs in Nigeria. We will discuss just a few of the important administrative bodies. Number 1. Federal Ministry of Works and Housing. The Federal Ministry of Works and Housing was established in 1975 by the Gowon Military Administration. A minister of cabinet rank who is assisted by a junior minister and other career civil servants head the ministry. Some of the more direct functions of the ministry are building research, construction, and maintenance of government quarters, housing policy and development, staff housing schemes, public housing programs, and interaction with other related federal government agencies such as the Federal Mortgage Bank and the Federal Housing Authority. The ministry is also saddled with the responsibility of coordinating, harmonizing, and supervising federal housing programs with those of the various states. 2. The Federal Housing Authority. The Federal Housing Authority was established by Decree No. 40 of 1973 as a corporate body with perpetual succession and a common seal. It is specifically charged with the responsibility of implementing the housing policies and programs of the federal government. Its more direct functions are 1. The preparation and submission to the government from time to time of proposals for the National Housing Program. 2. The making of recommendations to the government on areas of urban and regional planning, transportation, communication, electric power, sewage, and water supply development. 3. The execution of all the housing programs approved by the federal government. The decree that established the Federal Housing Authority not only gave it certain powers, but also outlined the procedures, activities, rights and obligations of the authority towards achieving its functions. The decree also provided for the inauguration of a board of directors that shall conduct the affairs of the organization. Number 3. State government agencies. There are two important bodies responsible for housing administration in Nigeria. These are the Ministry of Lands, Survey and Housing, which is headed by a commissioner and assisted by career civil servants, and Ministry of Housing Corporations. These ministries perform essentially the same functions as those of the federal government ministries already discussed. Housing corporations perform the following functions. A. The development, construction, and management of housing estates. B. The granting of loans to people wishing to build houses on their own land within the area of jurisdiction of each corporation. And C. The provision and maintenance of necessary social infrastructures such as roads, drains, electricity, water supply, etc. within the housing estates. Study session summary. In this lecture, we have discussed housing policy and administration. In the process, we first defined the concept of housing and also examined the historical background. Furthermore, we looked into the role of housing in the national development. We also discussed housing policies in other countries. The lecture concluded by examining the programs of housing development and administration in Nigeria. And that ends study session 13. Thank you for listening.